Please join me in a warm welcome for Lameen Abdul-Malik, Nobel Prize winner and advisor, FII Institute.
Here. Hello, good morning to our audiences here in Riyadh and across the world. So today I'm going to be having a discussion with Nathan Wolfe, who is the founder and CEO of Metabiota, a technology-based health company in the US. So before I get into a conversation with you, Nathan, I just wanted to share with you some of the work that the FI Institute has been doing. So perhaps some of you are aware that at the FI Institute, there's Think, Act and Exchange, and previously as the head of Think, we were tasked by our CEO to come up with something very innovative, like an index that will impact the world. And one of the reasons why we decided to choose an infectious disease index was looking at the concept of what actually kills people in the world, and to pick up a couple of ones that a lot of people have neglected about. Of course, everybody's very familiar with what's happened with the COVID pandemic. And just going back to the mandate of the FI Institute to empower the brightest minds for all, with all, to have a positive impact on the global community, was to look at what we call uncomfortable conversations and think about, okay, COVID is happening in the world. What other diseases are in the world that the world should actually be very aware of? So first of all, I just wanted to share with you that at the moment, infectious diseases actually result in 13 million annual deaths per year. TB is one of the #1 infectious diseases in the world. At the moment, it kills one person every 20 seconds. The last vaccine for TB was 100 years ago. I remember as a child, I actually had one in my arm here when I was living in Nigeria. But the TB vaccine is only valid for about 5 to 10 years of your life. And most people have TB. What would shock you actually is 25% of the global population, which is about 1.8 billion people, actually have TB, but it's actually latent. So one of the things we wanted to do at the FI Institute during my tenure was to say, okay, we need to sensitize this. And that led to having an infectious disease index to inform the world about how you're going to prepare for another pandemic. There's no point in saying, yes, this has been very devastating over the last 18 months. What is the world doing to prepare for that? So we decided to come up with an idea of working with an index, and we were very lucky we were able to hook up with Metabiota. And before I start going into the conversation with you, Nathan, just to reiterate, a final one coming from Metabiota is there's a 47 to 50% chance another pandemic will kill more people than COVID did in the next 25 years. So with that, I wanted to welcome you to the stage, Nathan. So before I go into talking about the index, I wanted to just ask you a couple of questions. So the world at the moment is currently focused obviously on COVID. How do you see COVID in the wider context of infectious diseases?
I think this is a deeply critical point for all of us, which is we are, of course, naturally deeply focused on COVID. But the reality is the frequency of pandemics has been steadily increasing over the past few decades and will continue to do so in the future decades. These are not things we can hope this will be the last one. Yeah. It's not going to be the last one. And the reality is we weren't prepared, and it's sort of, we don't have to discuss this, right? Yeah. This was an epic failure of public health systems to manage pandemics, to anticipate them and respond to them. But we do have the tools necessary to do so. And so I think this is sort of a unique moment in history where the world's attention is focused on this fundamental risk, and we have a chance to change the way that we address this in the future.
All right, thanks a lot, Nathan. I wanted to pick up one of the points you mentioned earlier on about the epic failure of actually health systems. So traditionally, people thought that, well, if you're in a Western environment, you're able to handle any kind of pandemic. What we saw with the last pandemic, it was actually the complete opposite. Just before we go on to the next question, do you have any light to share on why that was the case this time round?
I think part of the challenge is that we address all of the health issues we have in the same way. The way that you would deal with a steady year-to-year health issue like tuberculosis is in some ways very, very fundamentally different from the way that you would address and prepare for pandemics.
Yeah.
And so something that's very critical for me is recognizing the sort of centrality and the multi-sectoral features of these kinds of phenomena.
Yeah, okay, thanks. I mean, obviously we're here at the very impressive conference, the Future Investment Initiative Conference, and of course, looking at the word investment, there's a lot of people here actually very interested about what's going to happen in the future. So why do you think this is relevant for investors in terms of preparing for another pandemic?
So one way to address this is to think about climate. If we went back a few decades, most of the discussion about climate would have been at specialist research scientist meetings among earth scientists or ecologists.
Yeah.
But right now, if you saw climate as the domain of earth sciences, it would be completely wrong. This is something that central banks need to feature and think about deeply. CEOs need to be completely engaged in climate change. It's something that transcends all of the features of humanity.
Yeah.
And when I think of pandemic risk, it really is quite parallel to climate. This is a fundamental systemic risk that humanity faces, and it's a fundamental financial systemic risk. So I think it's important to remember that there was a loss of an estimated $5 trillion in global GDP associated with COVID-19. So these phenomena are not just health phenomena.
Yeah.
And there's a set of risks that will be faced by CEOs, by central bankers, by the insurance industry associated with these future events, which will be inevitable.
Yeah.
And so the nature of this event, in a way that I think is just like climate, it will force all ministries, all CEOs, they will have to be thinking about this, and those that are most effective at managing this risk and understanding the risk will be the ones that are resilient in the future.
Yeah.
The other thing I would say from an investment perspective is there's also huge opportunity here. There's a wide set of tools which are applicable and important that could be applied to the problem of mitigating the risk of these sorts of pandemics. And so if you think about cyber, the investment community has really picked up on cyber. Cyber is this opportunity to deploy technology to minimize risk.
Yeah.
Well, pandemic risk as a risk class is at least an order of magnitude more important than cyber, I would say. I don't think anybody would disagree with me now.
Yes.
So if you think of the market there, if we can switch our thinking as we've done with climate into seeing pandemics as a fundamental risk class, there's going to be a massive market and need for governments and corporations and insurance industry to address this. And so I think that the investors who understand that and invest in technologies that can address them will have tremendous success.
Yeah. I don't want to push too much on this because I know after this we have another session about technology and pandemics. However, I just wanted to reiterate three of the main things about the index that was developed by the FI Institute. So, for example, this index is a little bit unique in that it has both endemic and epidemic diseases on the index. The endemic diseases, as you know, are things like TB, malaria, HIV, lower respiratory disease and diarrheal diseases. But also epidemics, what was fascinating about the epidemics is that the tool developed by your company has an AI algorithm that tracks up to 60 pathogens on a daily basis, and that's really, really important. The second thing I just wanted to reiterate about the index was also that this also highlights which countries have the best performance by diseases. So in terms of the top 5 endemic diseases that I mentioned. Another thing that's also quite unique about the index is that it also shows which countries should be prioritized for system improvement, and that's really important going to your last point you mentioned, because in terms of it highlights for all 203 countries actually on the index where they're failing. So for investors to say, let's say for example, an investor wanted to invest, they were really concerned about health. Let's take a country like Chad, for example, or Togo, and said, okay, they're doing pretty poorly on HIV, and perhaps someone like the World Bank or private investors wanted to raise funds and say, okay, how can we help Togo or Chad improve in terms of having a more robust system to deal with infectious disease in the future? And the other point, just to reiterate what you mentioned earlier on, is this, the cross-section of zoonotic diseases as well, which is something that we should definitely be very aware of in terms of moving forward as we have a lot more migration, people moving away from rural areas into urban spaces. But of course, there's more interaction now between humans and also with livestock. So my final point, just to reiterate in terms of the index, this very unique index that was developed by the FI Institute, was, what do you think is the role of indices, and particularly organizations like the FI Institute, in terms of developing an index like this for the world?
Well, I think I would be negligent if I didn't start by sort of acknowledging yourself and the FII Institute. And I think if you think about the peers of the FII Institute, there's a universal focus on risk.
Yeah.
And the world is now focused on COVID-19. But I think there's a true insight that you all have had about thinking about the broader future risks associated with pandemic viruses and coming to us, which is what happened here, right? You approached us and said, hey, can we work together to utilize data and models that you have in order to address these indices? And so I think it really, there's a tremendous role, and I think there's a lot of insight that's gone into this. One thing is, so I'm not going to talk in huge detail about these indices, but fortunately for all of you, at 4 p.m. today, in the lab, the CEO of Metabiota, which is the organization I founded, and one of the world's leading data scientists in the area of pandemics, Nita Madhav, is going to be going into a detailed sort of demo and discussion of the indices. And so I would encourage everyone, to have a look at that. And I think these indices and approaches, I know that sort of communication is also a central feature here. The amount of data behind pandemics is immense. So just to geek out for a moment, we're talking about an n-dimensional hypercube of 13, 14 different parameters that we've modeled associated with this. This is something that Amazon Web Services wrote a case study of it because it sort of caused AWS to hiccup as we were doing these models. But translating that to the diverse audience of donors and CEOs and investors who are going to need to understand the differential risk is a great role for indices, right? And so I could imagine indices, we need to understand there's differential risk. Not all countries are at equal risk for pandemics. Not all corporations are at equal risk. Not all sectors are at equal risk. Different organizations and sectors will need different sorts of tools in order to most effectively manage this risk, just like they do, say, climate or cyber risk. And so, what I'm excited by in terms of this interaction is the idea that this could be sort of the beginning of a set of indices that would really address many different features of this risk and provide a easy to sort of communicate method of digesting that data along particular axes that will help many different communities to understand where the risks are systemically and how do we minimize those risks.
Yeah. All right. Thanks a lot, Nathan. Just to reiterate what Nathan mentioned. So at 4 o'clock today in the lab, we'll have a deeper dive into the index, talk about the pluses and minuses about it, the advantage of the index as well, and then we will also focus on potential aspects for investors to look at, as this is an investment-based conference, but also looking about investing in our humanity, and that was, part of this conference, impact on humanity. What are we doing now in this day and age to prepare to make sure that we mitigate the disaster of what we all experienced in the last 18 months. Thanks a lot, Nathan.
Thank you.
I think we have another session that's taking place after this, so please remain in the plenary for the next session on the investments in technology to prepare and prevent another pandemic. Thanks a lot. So I think okay.